First, the little bit of the basic background. Of course, it's on the web, tug.org/techlive. Just about everything I'm going to say is on there somewhere, and I'll point out some of the URLs as we go along. For anyone who may not know, and I know there's at least one person who doesn't know, it's a big cross-platform tech distribution. We try to make an official yearly release, including burning it onto DVD and sending it out. It's always been with updates throughout the year, though, after the official release. It's always been sponsored by all the tech user groups, especially Tug and Dante. And that's where their members and supporters, like the people in this room, are where the money comes from to make those DVDs and mail them. These days, I believe it's the basis for all the operating system distros that include TeX, such as Debian and Fedora and the BSDs. I'm not going to talk about the operating system versions because I know very little about them. I work on the so-called native TechLive, which is what the user groups distribute, which includes obviously lots of shareable packages, fonts and macros and so on, as well as compiled programs. Compiled programs include binaries for over 20 platforms these days, lots of versions of GNU Linux on lots of different hardware, Mac OS X, of course, thanks to Dick, and Windows, thanks to a colleague in Japan, Akira Kakuto. The independent stuff, the platform independent stuff, is about 3.5 gigabytes these days. That's without any of the binaries. 90% of that is documentation and fonts. I did the math for this talk, and I was kind of surprised, but the macros are a small part of what's in TechLive, even if it's possibly the most important part. And finally, a question that comes up sometimes is about the relationship between MikTeX and TechLive. MikTeX is a completely independent distribution. It was created and still maintained by Christian Schenk in Germany. As far as its tech support goes, it's only for Windows, unlike TechLive, which is for basically all the major platforms. But both TechLive and MikTeX use CTAN to get updates, which is where we're going to go next. So that's the basic overview. Okay. What does TechLive look like? And this is, I guess, one of the things Doug was wondering about. This horrible mess. And here are the URL I wanted to point out, tug.org/TDS. TDS stands for Tech Directory Structure. It's a document created by the user groups, or sponsored by the user groups, I guess I should say, maybe 15 years ago or more. It's still maintained, although we haven't needed to change it in quite a few years. And the most important thing about the TDS is that it segregates things by file type, as Paulo and kind of mentioned in passing yesterday. So all the documentation is under one directory doc, all the fonts are under directory fonts, and so on. You might wish, I know I have certainly wished sometimes, that all the files in a given package would be together under some directory named for the package. Instead of, right now they're scattered all over the tree in different subdirectories. I would wish that, however, it would be a tremendous burden to change that now. It doesn't seem worth that burden, so there aren't any plans to change it now, unless Doug convinces us otherwise somehow, perhaps. So almost everything in TechLive, the platform independent stuff, is under a top-level directory named techmf-dist, -dist for distribution. That name has changed a few times over the years. So there's almost nothing platform-specific under there. And then once you get beyond the file type, as I showed here, a couple of the basic intervening paths, there's kind of lots of subdirectories which can be named more or less random things, and there can be more or less random numbers of them. The code doesn't really care about all those intervening subdirectories. There's a configuration file, techmf-dist web2c techmf.conf, which you can take a look at that file if you want. It's really not that complicated. It's a little bit long, but not that complicated. So that's what TechLive looks like, kind of running live. For good so far. Start talking about updates. So kind of the one-line overview of how updates in TechLive happens is, of course, it starts with an author wanting to upload a new package or an update to an existing one. From there it goes to CTAN, from CTAN back to TechLive, gets massaged, goes back to CTAN, and then can make it to the user. And now we'll talk about all those steps in more detail. CTAN Stands for the Comprehensive Tech Archive Network. Again, for those who may not know, ctan.org. It's about 100 mirrors worldwide. I looked up right before the talk. Of course, more are always welcome if anybody here wants to host another mirror. And so, of course, we just wanted, for Tech Live, we just wanted to reuse CTAN to do updates instead of trying to invent our own thing. The authors for uploading start the upload, the URL at the top, ctan.org/upload. It's a fairly standard looking web form. Some instructions over on the right. I wanted to point out a couple of specific things which have caused concern over the years. One is CTAN only wants to hold sources for the most part. And most commonly that means not the dot, if the .sty file is derived from a .dtx, as many people in the room will know, they only want to hold the DTX. Frank talked about this a bit yesterday. But it's not always the case. They would like to hold a PDF, usually for documentation, if the author wants to write such a thing. And another thing on the form is, and that will come into play again on a slide or two. Another thing on the upload form talks about tds.zip. This is the same TDS that was on the last slide, tech directory structure. It's a way for authors to say exactly how they think their package should appear in Tech Live. And the important point about tds.zip is that it is not needed, it is not required, and it is not recommended, at least not by me. It's more work for the author to create it, it's more work for CTAN to install it, it's more work for Tech Live to deal with it. So occasionally there's a good reason for it, and that's why it exists, but usually there's no need for it at all. Another question that comes up sometimes is about announcements. Another thing on the upload form is about making a public announcement of the new version. That's great if you want to do it, but Tech Live will take the update. We'll find the update no matter what. We look at the actual contents of what's on CTAN instead of relying on announcements. And finally, see the last bullet there, the import from CTAN to Tech Live happens by hand. There's no cron job that does it. I've thought about it, but haven't made that happen. And it happens usually every day, and usually I'm the one who does it, unless I'm at a conference. So that's the kind of the author side of the update, is getting things started. The next step is getting it from CTAN into Tech Live, and here are the URL, Tech Live package update.html, and this is really what the Tech Live developers want to do. So very briefly, of course, just copy whatever got uploaded to CTAN, and now we have to make those derived files that were omitted from the upload, so process the DTX, or maybe make TFM files from Metafont sources, and so on. We don't actually remake the PDF that the author included. It should be possible in principle, but in practice, we discovered that it's a great hassle. There's too many possible errors, so it didn't seem worth the trouble. So we just use whatever the author gives us, almost always. And then distribute the files, whether they're newly created or original from the author, into the appropriate directories we talked about before, I mentioned before. Put them in the Tech Live tree. As you can imagine, there are special cases everywhere in this process. What files you need to be processed, what programs you need to process them, what arguments you give to the program, and so on and so on. All that is embedded in script, so that all I have to run is one top-level script unless something changes, which is why kind of one person can do this and not have it be impossible. So that's the import. And now the export side, so this is going to get the package back to the users. Tech Live package install.html is where I wrote down this. And here are the basic ideas. There's a big cron job that does run on tug.org every night that rebuilds Tech Live, more or less in the same way that happens for the official release. Of course, we don't actually burn a DVD every night. But the result of that, if there are no errors, goes to an area we call TLNet, Tech Live Network. CTAN copies from the TLNet on Tug to its TLNet, makes its way around CTAN, just like any other thing on CTAN, which can take a day or two. And then users who want to get that update can and are using native TeX Live. This is, let me emphasize, not the distro TeX, which are completely different in this regard. TL Manager Update is the kind of user level command to do that. And here the thing I wanted to say was, as I say on the slide there, this is the bleeding edge stuff. There was no testing that happened in the process as I've described it so far. The author uploaded, we imported, we exported. We never looked at what actually went into those files. So of course it's greatly appreciated for people to live on the bleeding edge when they can, because that's how testing happens. But it's always good to keep the stable version around. For those who do get the updates, I just thought I'd mention that by default it does go to this URL mirror.ctan.org, which should automatically so-called multiplex between all those 100 mirrors and try to find one that's hopefully nearby and hopefully up to date. Tries pretty hard, but of course no automatic choice is going to be perfect, so you can choose one. ctan.org/mirrors has the list of all the mirrors and more information about CTAN in general. That's basically the story of package updates in TeX Live. Good so far. Criteria for inclusion. So another question, what gets into TeX Live and what doesn't? TeX Live package contrib.html is the URL this time. And I'm afraid we only want normal characters, and by normal I mean 7-bit ASCII characters and file names. No @signs, no white space, no left quotes, no Unicode anything, no Portuguese tilde accents. Sorry. I know the operating systems can handle everything, but our scripts and all this infrastructure can't handle all that stuff. And again, so far we're just living with it instead of changing it. It will be a tremendous thing if it ever changes. So once we have these nice plain file names, they shouldn't create any conflicts. Obviously, it wouldn't work well to try to upload a new package with a file named plain.tex that's a new file. More commonly, with executables, it's even more important to come up with good names because, to go back to the distros for a minute, our programs are going to end up in the same directory as every other program on the operating system, typically user bin or almost every, on Unix. I don't speak of Windows, I don't know anything about that. But, and so, any name that's 4 letters is probably already used for something. It's just a fact. So, I'm not going to inflict that on the rest of the world. If somebody wanted me to install a package with an executable named try, T-R-Y, it's like, sorry, that's just not going to happen. Way too common. And so anyway, usually it works out pretty well to use the package name or an abbreviation of the package name as a prefix on the files that are, or executables that are going to be in the runtime. Okay, that's the technical stuff. On the licensing side, TeX Live has always been a free software project, which meaning it's released under the GNU GPL, LaTeX public license. There's lots of free software licenses out there, open source. If you won't go into that right now, but and the license should be explicitly stated somewhere in the files. It's just ideally in every file, although most packages fail to reach that ideal, including mine. And of course, the source should be available for whatever's being uploaded, and that includes, notably, the source for that PDF documentation. If there isn't any source for that at all, then I'll just exclude the PDF from TeX Live. We'll still distribute the rest of the package, and people can get the PDF from CTAN, which has different rules. But I won't include it without source. Paulo told me yesterday that there's all kinds of PDFs in TeX Live now that don't have source, which doesn't surprise me. I never tried to go back and look at every PDF in TeX Live, but when people tell me about them, then I'll take them out. or usually ask the author to upload the source, and usually they're fine with doing that. It's rarely intentional, an intentional omission. And the package should be useful in itself, of course most packages are, or in conjunction with other free software like LaTeX or a Perl script or something to do with Octave or what have you. The canonical counterexample, which is probably the only even semi-controversial policy decision that I ever have enforced, is LPPL support for proprietary fonts. So people make TeX support for lots of fonts. The TeX support is released under a free license, but the font itself comes from Microsoft or Adobe or Lucida, much as we love Lucida. And so the only purpose for that support is to promote the use of the proprietary font, and that's just not part of what TeX does. So we don't include that anymore. And finally, if it meets these criteria, then it's accepted. So some of the things I didn't talk about were, what job does the package do? How many other packages might already do that job? How important is that job? How good is the code? Does the code meet any standards, as Will was mentioning yesterday? I very rarely look at the actual contents of the files that I'm dealing with, unless I have to. So if it meets the criteria, it goes in. And that's pretty much what I had to say about packages. Still good? All right. Moving on to the other side of the world, programs, by which I mean the compiled programs for the most part from sources. And here the basic URL, tog.org TeX-Live SVN. Those of you who know a bit about version control might recognize SVN as meaning subversion. We do use subversion, but you don't need to use any version control to get at the TeX-Live sources or to build them, only if you're going to commit to the tree, in which case I need to know who you are. And that web page talks about lots of other ways to get the sources. And the source tree is divided into these two uppermost top-level directories, capital M master and capital B build. So far, everything we've talked about is under master, so TeXMFDist is under master. And that got its name because it's effectively the master for what gets written on the DVD. Build, on the other hand, has nothing that's ready to run. It's essentially just the sources to be compiled. And that's about 600 megabytes these days. That includes obviously all the TeX stuff and lots of third-party libraries that weren't written for TeX at all, mainly to deal with, not mainly, but somewhat to deal with OpenType and Unicode, plenty of others. I think it's about half and half these days, about TeX and non-TeX stuff. Some parts of the tree are actually maintained in TeX-Live, so we're the so-called final upstream for things like the infamous path searching library in DVIPS and Web2C, which we'll talk about a bit later. But most of what's in the tree actually comes from elsewhere, and that includes the other engines I listed here, and almost all the other kind of random utilities all come from somewhere else, and we import them into TeX-Live. And of course, try hard to sync everything up and talk to the authors at the time of the yearly release and fix all the inevitable bugs and so on. So that's the overview of the source tree. Moving on to how the build actually works. Here are my web pages, TeX-Live-build.html, and this is the page that I point at people who want to build TeX-Live for a given platform for kind of the high-level thing of what to do. You need C and C++ compilers. These days you don't need anything else. They don't have to be the GNU compilers, although those are the ones most commonly used. Other compilers are used for some platforms that we distribute. And there's a script, build/build, so that's the script capital B build in the directory capital B build, which does the job. So if you run build, hopefully in half an hour or 2 hours or however long it takes on your platform, you'll get a directory of binaries out. And if you look at that script, again, this is another thing which is not that complicated, although it's a little bit long. It basically boils down to configure and make, which for those of you who've built from source, GNU or lots of other free software from source, is kind of a standard way to deal with these things. And a couple points about the build. So it's done in all the intermediate files, the object files and so on, are done in a separate, kept in a separate directory, separate subdirectory build/work with a capital W, and the final results are put in build/inst with a lowercase I for no good reason. And the source directories are left completely alone, which turns out to be very helpful for a variety of reasons. And again, we'll see a bit more about that. And the other important point is the result of this is, as I say there, not a usable TeX system. It's a directory of executables. So it does not have any of the support files. There's no fonts, there's no plain text, there's no macros, there's certainly no LaTeX. None of that is there. So what people do with this to use it is copy it over onto the master side. Master bin, that's where the directory's bin platform name come from in TeX Live, is by copying that directory of results. And that's the overview of building. For my last important slide, I'd give an actual example inspired by one of Dave Walden's questions to me a while back about what happens with Knuth's original TeX these days. And here the URL that I wanted to say was TeX Live docs tlbuild.html. There's a PDF there too. That's a fairly extensive manual that we wrote about how TeX Live builds work with lots and lots of options, which I'm obviously not going to go into here. One of the sections in that manual is about how to build just one package, which after all, one often wants to do. And you can do that with the original TeX and build just that and nothing else. So the first question is, where is this file? And I won't say the path, but there it is. And tech.web is Knuth's original file, completely unchanged as per his wishes. Perhaps I'm not sure if there's anybody who doesn't know, but perhaps he invented the literate programming system that Doug alluded to in a variety of ways, which combines TeX and Pascal and the Pascal is all munged around, so the web file is nothing that can be compiled or TeXed for that matter directly. And he wrote it for a very specific system, I believe the TOPS 10 and a very specific Pascal compiler, Charles Hedrick's, I think. And these days the TOPS 10, I believe, probably only exists in computer museums, maybe and Nelson's emulator, I think, right? So, of course, Knuth knew people would want to adapt TeX to other systems, and so there's the concept of a change file, which will override what's in the web file. Of course, you should only override the parts you're supposed to override and not the other parts. In TeX Live, the reality of TeX Live these days is there's several change files which do various things. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but there's a utility tie which combines all those change files together into one big one. The utility Tangle, which is one of Knuth's programs, applies that change file to his web file and throws away all the TeX, rearranges all the Pascal into something that could be compiled and end up with a Pascal file. And then if you have a Pascal compiler, you can compile that, maybe, if it's good enough. Of course, especially in the mid-'80s on Unix, well, I don't know. In any case, people would often prefer to use C compilers or only have C compilers and not Pascal compilers. So early on, again, as Doug mentioned, there was a Web2C developed by Tom Rokicki at Stanford and shortly thereafter Tim Morgan, which converts the Pascal tech.p to a bunch of .c files. It's not at all a general purpose converter of Pascal to C. It's very specific to the to Knuth's web files. And then you compile the C files just like any other C files, link with our little helper library that provides the things that Pascal expects that C doesn't, like EOF and EOLN, if you're unfortunate enough to know Pascal. And if all goes well, you'll end up with an executable named TeX, and you can do stuff with it, like run it on debugger, most likely. Usually, I just wrote -I and I here to emphasize that there aren't any format files here, so you better not go try to look for them, and it's probably not going to work to try to make them dynamically either. And my last point was, okay, so we've done all this. Now, why were we doing this again? It was so we could fix a bug or add a new feature or something. Probably not to TeX, but unless you're Doug, but then we wouldn't be in this world in the first place. So you want to edit a file. Let's see if I can go backwards. I can. So you can edit a file, a source file, edit pretty much any source file in the tree, including in the libraries, and then run make again in the work subdirectory, which was the intermediate working directory. And all the dependencies should be there so that if you change a file in a library and then rerun make, it should go and happily recompile the file, remake the library, relink the executable, and you can go on with your work. And so you don't need to do the whole build again. I often see people thinking that they have to restart from scratch when they change a single file, and that's not necessary. That's pretty much my story on building Knuth's TeX. And my last slide is just a few people I wanted to acknowledge. Thomas Esser created TeX in kind of the mid-'80s, I think, which is really the predecessor of TeX Live. Sebastian Rotz created TeX Live in the mid-'90s. These days, Norbert Preining, who wishes very much he could have been here and says hello to everybody here, was primarily responsible for the package infrastructure. He implemented TL Manager and almost everything underlying that. Peter Brettenlohner has worked on TeX a very long time, longer than me, I think, is really responsible for most of the program infrastructure. So there's a very uniform setup in our world, and that's mainly due to his work. And of course, the thing that makes all of this interesting is so many people contribute in so many ways, writing manuals, submitting bug reports, writing new packages. And of course, we should always acknowledge Don Knuth for creating the thing. And that's my talk. Thanks for listening. Any questions? Doug.
What percentage of TeX Live is used by any given user?
No clue. But it's obviously going to...
One significant figure, 0%. I think I use a lot, but I don't even use 2%.
I'm not sure you actually know that.
Yeah.
So much cost.
I mean, plus it depends on what you're going to take the percentage of, right?
I mean,
If you're just talking about...
I'm trying to understand, I understand how great it is that everybody has exactly the same thing, but then I'm wondering about, why are you distributing it all? Why isn't the internet sort of serving what people need to them dynamically, and it's cached on their system, et cetera?
Because I don't want to depend on the internet when I compile my document.
There's one sort of very important aspect on what we do with TeX over the years, which is really that TeX and LaTeX in particular forms sort of an exchange language for people. And that requires that you actually, and this is one of the reasons why we have this, some people think very weird license in the LaTeX work that actually tries to balance between modification and free sources as well as preserving the aspect of being an exchange language. And that is greatly supported by the fact that you actually can rely on, if people keep up with distributions within it is made very easy to do so with something like TeX Live, that they are actually talking to each other and can understand each other. So this is, I think it is one of the success stories in the mathematics, at least, that people have this as a legal framework. If you would have everything sort of bleeding edge differently or partially, it would not work.
So I think the direct answer to your question is probably very little, but of course different people will have a very different, very little subset,
Well, you have 300 executables. Does anybody realize how many executables are there?
Right, but some of them are used by everybody. I mean, some of them are used by all of them are used by somebody. Boris.
Yeah, maybe it's a question, maybe it's a comment, I don't know. I now support TeX installations at several customers, important thing, and some of them are very security-minded people. And let me tell you the thing which prevents me sleeping at nights. I know that you have security features like write 18, it's disallowed, you can go above. But what I'm thinking always, I think that you have LaTeX, and LaTeX has internet capabilities. I don't know that what. Somebody uploads a nice style file, with LaTeX, a nice stack. And somewhere in this LaTeX package, you have a simple line which takes everything which is compiled and sends to some site in some third party who just logs all their documents. And if they find out, first they will kill me. So my question is, it looks like this model that we have, I just put everything which comes to C10, and C10 takes basically everything which comes. This has serious security implication. And do you have any advice? Right now, I will tell you what I do. I just say that, okay, we don't use LaTeX because I can work with writing, with file mangling, but I just don't know about LaTeX internet libraries.
You mean LuaTeX, right?
LaTeX,
Yeah.
yes, because fortunately PDF and ZTeX they don't go to internet.
Right. I think the answer is lobby Hans and Taco to put in configuration variables into LuaTeX about don't ever go to the internet.
Yeah,
Similar to Write 18.
Yeah, maybe this is a thing because right now we don't have security.
Yeah,
security
I know.
model for C10 and TechLeaf, and as long as our community
Well,
is small and everybody knows it will work, but
well, I think it's more. It's not even so much that. I mean, who knows everybody in the tech community, but you can't. The tech programs are very limited in their capabilities, except for LuaTeX.
yes,
And so, as long as you run only what, has been looked at seriously, there's only a few programs that are allowed to run under Write 18, and you can turn it off completely if you want.
yes.
And every one of those programs, I can tell you, we looked very carefully at those programs. That's not to say you can't make a mistake. Of course, you can always make a mistake, but it wasn't just ignorance that led to that list. So I think, lobby Hans and Taco.
Probably need.
Yeah,
Thank
Paulo.
you. Thank you. I probably will write them. and
Yeah.
Talk with them. Thank you.
How much effort goes into providing support for TeX alpha, MIPS, providing?
If somebody makes a binary, I'll put it in. I don't care.
And do we know that those things are used, downloaded, and so on?
There's no way to know how many people download anything because of the 100, there's, besides the 100 mirrors, which you could imagine theoretically you could get statistics out of those 100 mirrors, although in practice you never could. But beyond that, probably most people, probably the majority of people, majority of authors, not people in this room, but just people using tech to do their jobs, either use an operating system version of tech that just came with their operating system and it works fine, they use it, that's it. Or they use McTech if they're on Windows. And there's no way you're going to get any statistics about anything. So there's a perennial question in the tech world of how many tech users are there, and it's unanswerable as far as I can tell. Will.
You should build that feature to Tech Live to send all the documents to the internet.
You implement it and I'll consider it, Will. Have neat.
For a while, my Spark station was serving context, or it was doing but the flip side of that is sometimes the build dependencies outgrow the OS, the host OS. And finally, Moika said it's not working. Taco didn't want to support the special make modifications to do Solaris.
Right.
And it falls off.
Right. I mean, there's for platforms that people care enough about to make the build work, you can make it work. I mean, it's not rocket science to track down the build problems, but it does take time, effort, and energy, and there's only so much of all those that we have. So the platforms people care about, there's binaries for. If they don't care about them, there's no binaries for them.
We now have several implementations for telephones, so you can have definitely on telephone. On smartphone.
But not BlackBerry, come on. And that's
Jim.
That's QNX.
So, Carl, I guess I want to say two things. The first is I'd like to thank you for your work on Tech Live.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
And the second is I wanted to expand just a little bit on the TDS.zip, if you don't mind. People in this room might sort of help to set the community's idea of what's kind of the best thing to do. One of the problems from the CTAN perspective, I don't work on CTAN anymore, but this arose when I did work. So one of the problems is if somebody uploads TDS.zip alone, that's not browsable. I mean, it's not discoverable by just clicking around and trying to figure out what this package does. The TDS.zip is not, the TDS layout is just not built for it. So people were uploading two essentially copies of the same material. One copy is this TDS.zip and the other is the material laid out in a browsable form. And I don't need to tell anybody in the room that if, if you get 50, 100, or 200, or 300, however many people upload in a year, each of them uploading two copies of something, some percentage of those are, not actually copies, and now you're trying to find somebody who uploaded something 2 years ago, and these two files aren't the same, which one is the right one, and etc. So it's really, from the CTAN perspective, it's really violating, isn't it the first rule of databases? Is don't repeat yourself. Is that the first rule? Now, I know probably you have different concerns with TDS.zip, but
It's actually quite similar in that my basic problem with TDS.zip is that my experience is that everybody will make an error sooner or later. So far, everybody who's ever uploaded TDS.zip has made an error. Heiko has made an error. Joseph Wright has made an error. It's like Scott Pagan has made an error. If those people can't get it right every time, you can be sure that, And the point is, there's no reason for it. In most cases, I'm not speaking of the LaTeX distribution, okay? But for random packages, people have this idea, and I don't know where it comes from. I think it comes from the upload page, that somehow it's a good thing. It's a helpful thing to kind of routinely provide TDS.zip. For fonts, perhaps, although I'm not even convinced about that. But in essence, that mapping from the browsable CTAN tree to TDS should happen in one place, and that place should be my import script, which is what my import script does.
So we should talk with Joseph, because he explicitly put that into L3 build.
Right, and I think that's fun. I mean, I'm not going to speak against what Joseph did. I think he's fabulous, right? But and it's helpful in its way. So, but
it might be good to have that not as a default if you don't.
Yeah.
For something like latent distribution.
Yeah.
It is complicated enough
Right.
to actually control the
Yeah.
distribution setup. But
Yeah, we'll talk. Okay, thank you, everybody.